This is TWiT.
Our first guest, Will Aramis, is here to talk to us about the battle of big tech. Yes, it's a big headline and a big story, and Will helps us understand all of it. Welcome to the show, Will.
It's good to be here, Mikah.
So you have written a great article over on the Washington Post, and I saw it via a tweet that you sent out where you kind of were talking about your observations on what's going on here. So before we kind of get into the nitty-gritty details, I was hoping we could start with kind of a blanket explanation of what the heck is going on. Can you talk a little bit about what led to this ruling as far as the different groups that had put forth these antitrust lawsuits and kind of what the initial impact was there leading up to this first court ruling?
Yeah, so for a long time, U.S. courts have had a pretty hands-off attitude toward antitrust, and particularly with respect to the big tech platforms. There was the famous case U.S. versus Microsoft in the 1990s. And the government got kind of mixed results on that. Ever since then, they've kind of taken the stance of like, the internet's a dynamic marketplace. The company that's on top today could be on the bottom tomorrow. Let's see how it all shakes out. Let them play, right? Let's not be jumping in there and blowing whistles. And so just in the past maybe 3 years or so, there has emerged a strong countervailing way of thinking, both in terms of politics and in the legal world. And Lina Khan, who Biden recently installed and was approved as the chair of the FTC, was one of the academic leaders of this. And she said, no, it's actually time to reinvigorate antitrust law. These tech giants have become the biggest companies in the world. They're throwing around their weight and their market power. They're crushing smaller competitors. And we need to think about how they operate differently. And as part of that, we've seen now become mainstream the idea that these tech companies should be taken on with antitrust cases. Google and Facebook have already been sued. Amazon and Apple are allegedly being investigated. They're the subject of probes. There's legislation in both the House and the Senate. And all of it broadly is about sort of reining in the power of these tech giants, not to offer their core services that people know and love and which are often free, but to expand into other markets and to take over smaller companies, to drive out smaller companies, those kinds of competition issues.
Mm-hmm. And so, Amazon, I think, is a good example of this in the different, what is it? Is it fingers and pies? I think that's what it is. Yeah, all of the different pies in which they have their fingers firmly placed. But with this most recent legislation, because I remember was multiple states' attorneys that filed these lawsuits, and the FTC altogether were coming after Facebook. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I believe it was the DOJ that sued Google at the federal level, and then at the federal level, the FTC sued Facebook, and then at the same time, and kind of along with that, there was another suit from most of the attorneys general of the United States, the different states. Gotcha.
So this is the interesting thing: is that when this court case, when the ruling came through, which we'll talk about in just a second, it was immediately, as often is the case with these kind of high-profile lawsuits, is you immediately say, the initial reaction is, okay, are we setting precedent here? Are we setting precedent here? Is this going to shape how the rulings go going forward? But your piece, The Battle to Break Up Big Tech, has just begun. Maybe flies in the face of that. So can you talk a little bit about what the judge had to say, what the ruling was, and then why folks maybe thought that this was going to look to a future where the tech companies are winning, but you're maybe saying, I don't know about that.
Yeah, so on Monday, a district court judge, a federal judge in Washington, tossed out both the FTC's federal case against Facebook and the lawsuit from the state attorneys general. And the judge did so on several different grounds. For one thing, he said that the states, they were suing in part to try to unwind or to challenge the Facebook's acquisitions of Instagram in 2012 and WhatsApp in 2014. He said, "Look, you waited too long. It's too late. You can't come back this much later and challenge that." With the federal case, the FTC case, his main argument was a little different. He tossed the complaint because he said, "You are alleging that Facebook has a monopoly. And you've defined, the case defined the market in which Facebook competes as personal social networking." Now, that's not an everyday term to most of us. They kind of made it up, I think, because it's hard to define. That's part of the issue with pursuing antitrust cases against these companies. It's hard to define exactly what the market is that they're monopolizing. The suit said Facebook controls over 60% of the market for personal social networking, but it didn't really back that up very much. The suit was really a lot more about Facebook's behavior and trying to show that Facebook had behaved in anti-competitive ways, throwing its weight around to crush competitors. But the judge just looked at that and said, "Well, look, if you didn't show any of your work to get to this idea that Facebook controls 60% of this market. And so I'm just tossing this. You can come back." The judge said, "You can come back within 30 days, refile this, make a better argument. Don't just expect me to accept that Facebook has a monopoly here. Actually make the case. I mean, what kind of metrics are you using? By what measure does Facebook have a monopoly of this market? And then I'll consider letting the case move forward." So this is obviously a big blow to the case. I mean, to get tossed out at this level, this was a motion to dismiss, which is one of the first lowest hurdles that a case like this has to clear, and it didn't clear it. So that's on its face a bad sign for the court cases against Facebook. That court battle is not over, however. I mean, it certainly seems clear that the FTC could improve its case, and it might clear that hurdle and get on to the next stage. But I think the maybe broader takeaway here is that the courts haven't changed, right? I mean, there's been this new school of thinking about antitrust and the big tech companies, but the courts are still relying on the same decades of precedent that they were relying on before. And so just because some of the sort of popular view of antitrust has begun to evolve doesn't mean the courts are going to accept that. They don't, Lena Khan made a fascinating argument in her famous paper, Amazon's Antitrust Paradox, but that doesn't mean it's going to fly with a district court judge until or unless the norms change or the laws change or both. And so I actually think it's not that surprising that this case is having trouble in the courts. Some of the antitrust experts I've talked to said they really didn't think it was going to go anywhere. And that actually might help the lawmakers who are trying to say, no, we actually need to change the laws. If we want to go after big tech companies and rein in their power, it's clear that we already know that the existing laws don't work for that. And here is example A. I mean, here is a court tossing out a case saying that we can't prove Facebook's a monopoly. Well, look, everybody, it seems clear that Facebook's a monopoly. So let's change the laws, give the courts clearer direction. So I think for that effort in the House and the Senate, that might actually stand to benefit from the swift dismissal in the courts, if that makes sense.
Yes, that does. And I mean, so let's talk a little bit more about what you were saying there about the courts not changing. Precedent, of course, plays a huge role in court judgments, in court cases. From your perspective, do you feel like the courts need to change? They need to update their thinking based on what kind of society is? And I know that this gets into a little bit of political stuff, but in your personal opinion, do you think that there could be an antitrust ruling that is against big tech, so to speak, if the thinking of the courts doesn't change? Is it going to take that kind of mentality to change in order for that ruling to come through? Or do you think that there is enough evidence for these cases to come through and provide that evidence to get rulings with the current kind of thinking of the court? Does that make sense? I know that was kind of all around, but...
No, I think it's a good question. I mean, I don't have an answer to that. I've talked to experts who are on both sides of that question. I've talked to some who say the courts are never going to change how they rule on these companies until Congress directs them to do so. And that's why legislation is the route here and not the courts. One of my sources in the story was Hal Singer. He's an antitrust economist, and he's often called in as an expert witness in antitrust cases. And he said, look, I've just been through enough of these cases. The judges aren't going to change their mind until you change the law. I've talked to others who say, well, absolutely. I think, if you look at the history of antitrust, the court's interpretation has changed without changes in the law in the past. It just takes time. I mean, the current paradigm took root in the 1970s with Robert Bork persuading the legal establishment to take a more laissez-faire approach to antitrust law. It's conceivable that Lena Khan's influential article, and she has a bunch of fellow travelers who are, you sometimes get lumped in as hipster antitrust or the neo-Brandeisians, but who are arguing that actually the laws already on the books do support a more robust approach to these companies, and that you just need to change how we interpret them, and that it should all be doable without changing the law. Honestly, I don't know. I think it probably varies somewhat from judge to judge. I mean, you get a judge whose biggest concern day to day is they don't want to get an opinion that's going to get laughed at by a higher court or thrown out because that looks bad for them. Well, they're going to take a conservative line. Maybe you get a judge who thinks, you know what, these neo-Brandeisians are right and the courts have had it wrong forever, and I'm going to take that stand. Either one could happen, but certainly this was, I think, a point in the favor of those who argued that the more direct way to rein in big tech's power, if that is the goal, is to do it through legislation instead of the courts.
Understood. So another thing that we've seen a lot of is, I've seen several headlines kind of fly by about this, is lobbying on the part of the different tech companies. How much of a role do you think that is going to play going forward? And I think that the focus on that maybe suggests that this is some sort of new practice. And I realize this is a bit of a leading question, but for folks who may be thinking that this is business as normal, right? When it comes to one side wanting one thing and one side wanting another, these tech companies kind of increasing their lobbying efforts is pretty standard, right?
Yeah, I mean, the largest tech companies have been building up their lobbying operations for a decade. I mean, I think that, so if you recall, 10 years ago or so, SOPA, PIPA, the Stop Online Piracy Act about copyright, that was a wake-up call to the tech companies that they couldn't just operate in their Silicon Valley world and expect to be untouched by Washington, D.C. And so they started forging relationships with lawmakers. They started hiring lobbying firms. They are now some of the biggest lobbying spenders in the country. And that has been true for years now, but we haven't necessarily seen it come to a head in a public way until now. So I think that's why some of the lobbying is now starting to get the attention. I mean, they've had the ground game going for years now. I mean, they have lobbyists who have the ears of staffers on both sides of the aisle. They have a lot of influence that they've built up sort of slowly, with soft power for years, so that when they got to this point, when there's a movement to try to break them up, when there's, an emergency from their perspective in DC, they have those relationships. They can knock on those doors, say, hey, look, remember when we advised you on this or helped you out on that? Well, we've got a real problem here, and you need to help us, and you got to go to bat for us. And I think we're seeing that. One of the places you can see that is that in the House of Representatives, where the most sweeping package of antitrust legislation is working its way through committees and such. In a big committee vote last week in the House Judiciary Committee, it was mostly Democrats in favor of the antitrust reform. It was mostly Republicans opposed, but 4 Democrats joined the Republicans in opposing the antitrust reform, and 3 of them were from California. One of them was Zoe Lofgren from Silicon Valley. And so you can kind of see the influence that the tech companies have, especially in California, with the lawmakers there. And that's certainly a hurdle for the Democrats who want to get this legislation through, is to convince their own party members, don't listen to the big tech lobbyists. So yeah, the battle is really just, it's playing out now, even though the troop buildups have been happening for years.